Okay, I'm continuing the series that I started several weeks ago on the alternative Christian, and that is we do not take a traditional view of the whole Christian message, but it is the desire that we have. I know I came from a very traditional background, the Baptist upbringing, or actually Church of Christ is where I started. That's where I was baptized. I was immersed in the baptismal fount there, mainly so I could drink grape juice and eat crackers. It was an exciting milestone in my life. But actually, I got a taste of the grape juice sooner than that. I used to mow the yard for the church. A friend of mine and I, we were very young kids, and it was 100 degrees in Missouri and very high humidity, and so we were taking a break and went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator thinking there might be some water or something in there to drink, something cold, and there was some grape juice. So we helped ourselves to the grape juice. We thought how wonderful that was. Found that we had just drunk the communion for next Sunday, so I guess I'm totally saved if that has anything to do with anything. But I appreciate my traditional upbringing mainly because, or not mainly, but it has helped me communicate with those of you that have come from similar backgrounds. I understand where you're coming from. Mine was not that extreme. You know, I've heard some stories that are pretty spine-tingling, coming from more traditional approaches. And I think a lot of that was due to my family. My parents did not, they made us go to church, which I did not want to do. But they did not force upon us like, you know, you do something wrong at home, they're saying, well, you're going to burn in hell for that or anything like that. That was never part of the conversation. Hell was enough just with my dad's anger, you know, so that we didn't need to go someplace to get that. But it was, I just appreciate it because what the traditional Christian comes from is basically what is taught in the Bible. And I know that when we get into something like New Thought thinking, we would rather think there's a deeper meaning to it, and there is a deeper meaning. But the question that we are raising in this series is, did the original writers see that deeper meaning? And what we are looking at is the idea of, we have 4 Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we have a Gospel according to Jesus. That is, that the writers in the very beginning probably started with a list of sayings, not any written form of anything but sayings, and these were probably collected over time. And I was just thinking about this process, how it might occur. You can imagine that all of these little communities around that would have heard of Jesus' death, they probably never met him, they probably heard of him, but never came face to face with him or, you know, heard him live. But they heard about him. And so they heard about this idea that he was put to death, or the tragedy of his being put to death. He was touted by some Jews as the Messiah. Many did not believe that he was the Messiah. And so the ones that did not believe, that strain of thinking still is waiting for the Messiah to show up. But there was a group that saw him as the Messiah. And so they hear of his death, and nothing happens. You know, the fulfillment of the prophecies and all that the Messiah was supposed to bring, the change, the salvation from our suffering and all of the things that a Messiah is supposed to deliver, nothing's happened. And so what they do is all of the scholars that believe this, and this would be a fairly small number of people, they would have started searching the scriptures for prophecies, for ideas that talked about what do we expect in this person? How do we see him? You know, how can we identify? How do we know? And if you'll read the Gospel of Matthew, you'll find Matthew is very strong on that. He goes back to the Old Testament time and time again. This was done to demonstrate the prophecy from Isaiah or whatever. He says he uses this all the time. One of the best examples. But that's how they were all thinking, the early followers that believed Jesus was the Messiah. But here they are disappointed because nothing's happened. And so this idea of him returning begins to emerge. He didn't do it the first time around, so they search all the scriptures, why is that? And they come up with all kinds of reasons for that. And they begin to recall some of the things he said. And these were probably written down and collected by scribes. They didn't have Xerox back then, so they had people that were professional scribes, people that would copy the Jewish scriptures. That was their job, over and over, because they would not last that long. The technology back then, paper, papyrus, whatever they were using to write on, there were several mediums to write on, were not all that, didn't have that much longevity in terms of how we think of it today. So that's what they did all the time. And so you can imagine, and probably the percentage of people that could read and write in the various little towns around, what scholars think about 1 to 5%, probably more like 1%. There may have been one person in the whole town that could read. And they would have readers, they would read from the Torah when they would meet in the synagogue, and somebody would get up and read a scripture, from the Torah, from the law. And what I could imagine happened was they began to collect these sayings that were attributed to Jesus, the ones that were believers, and they would maybe start incorporating that in the readings that they would have. And so you had this list of sayings from Jesus, and this is kind of a scholarly theory that's out there, and to me it makes a lot of sense, because Jesus didn't just die and then somebody sits down and writes his life story. That didn't happen that way. Scholars believe it started in very much the way I'm describing here, that the people that knew how to read and write, there were very few, and maybe there was a person who, one of these scribes, saw the importance of this, and he saw, okay, we've got this list of sayings, and it's really cool, but everybody's memorizing it. All this time is passing, and they've got that down, but we need something more. We need something to get their attention. And he would have known that people then as now love stories. And so he would have taken this list of sayings probably throughout his entire life, and he would put them into a narrative, into a story form. And he did this anonymously. All four Gospels are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. They say, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but these names were added later. The earliest copies that we have, which are about 160 years after the death of Jesus, we don't have any. They're anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. And that would make perfect sense, because say like we're here in this group and somebody decides to write a story about a holy man or something that we may not think that person's all that credible. It may be better to have something that nobody's quite sure where it came from. There's a lot of writings out there. Channel material is kind of a good example of that. If the person dropped the idea that it's channeled, nobody would read it. But because it comes from a kind of a mysterious source, it captures us, captures our imagination. So I could imagine a scribe spending his whole life, putting together this story of Jesus that is captivating. It's like a movie. A lot of us would rather see a movie than read a book. Not always, but it's entertaining. It's more entertaining. And it helps you remember the teachings. You take all the sayings of Jesus and you put them in a context, and it's like a teaching. That makes sense now, if that's how it was done, if that's how it was said. So you can imagine this whole process occurring, and maybe this scribe, stuck this, he created this say the first gospel, and we know that was Mark, but I'm just using this as an example. Maybe he stuck it away and he died, and maybe years passed, and his family went through his effects one day, and they found this bunch of scrolls. None of them could read anything in it. But they know this other scribe over in the next town, and they take this whole pile of things over there, and he says, "Yeah, I got a ton of work to do. I don't have time to go through that now, but just lay it over there and I'll get to it and see what's in there." So maybe his whole life passed. Maybe he never looked at it. Maybe he died and his family did the same thing, passed it on years later. About 30 years pass. Somebody else finds this, and what is this? It's the story of Jesus. We recognize all these sayings. We use them in synagogue. But I've never heard this story. Isn't this something? And so they begin to pass that around, and the reader, instead of just reading from the Torah and from the sayings, the list of sayings of Jesus, they begin to share this story. And everybody comes alive. Their eyes pop open. But the question is, there would be a gap between this list of sayings, the sayings or teachings of Jesus, and the story that is told around those, the story that those are placed in. And I think that's what happened with the whole Easter thing. There were many sightings. Let me just start with this here. From Matthew, it says he is not here. You got the women running to the tomb. He's not here, for he is risen as he said. Come see the place where he lays. So according to Matthew's version of the resurrection, when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb, they found it empty. An angel was there to tell them Jesus had risen from the dead. So none of this was even thought about immediately. It's told that way, but this story is probably the product of the writer. Obviously not of Jesus himself, because Jesus wasn't around to tell the story. But just lines like, he's not here for he is risen as he said. That's how the writer would influence, the value, the importance of what's being said. He puts words in Jesus' mouth. Takes from this list of sayings and then takes liberties, adds things to it, and then pretty soon you have this Easter story. It's interesting also that if you read the appearance stories, and actually, again, Mark being the first one written, has an appearance story at the end. I think it's the 16th chapter. The earliest version of that, it's not there. There is no appearance story. It was added later. And scholars know this for a fact. And if you look at your Bible, you'll probably see a footnote, at the very end of it, that says the earliest authorities do not include this particular section. But we sit down and we read these things, and we think they just kind of popped up, and we're very accurate. We're dictated by God and all of that. But there's an evolution of literature. And, you just have to try to put yourself in that situation where nobody reads and writes. Very few people do. And the ones that do, they see maybe the value of recording or keeping a written record of what they have heard someone say, that maybe they didn't know Jesus directly, but they knew somebody that did know him, and this is what he said at such and such a time. And so they put these stories down and all of that, and it evolved over time. But keep in mind, there were two factions, at least in the early development, the early church development, and that is the Jews that did not accept that Jesus was the Messiah, and the ones that did. So what's interesting about the appearance stories is Jesus only appears to the believers. He appears only to those that believed he was the Messiah. And all you got to do is read the accounts. And in some cases, it says there were a lot of them. But we don't know what that means. We don't know what a lot means. When he entered into Jerusalem on the triumphal entry, as we talked about last week, it just looks like the whole world was there, on stage. But most scholars say it was probably a very small thing, and maybe it didn't happen at all. We don't really know. But we're not here to debunk that. We're here to look beyond and to. Oh, another important thing here is those early followers that embrace this literal Jesus is the Messiah and he's coming back. They embrace that in the context that he is coming any moment. Any moment. And here, 2,000 years have passed, and they were thinking any moment. And of course, you'll hear this today. You'll hear ministers get up any moment. This is going to happen any moment. It's like, when was the Mueller report going to be released? It's any moment. It's just but it's an important idea to keep that in context, because the fulfillment of all that was taught then, that they thought Jesus represented, was supposed to happen right then. And we see that. They called it the last hour, that we're dwelling in the last hour. This comes from 1 John. Children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore we know it is the last hour. There was always somebody popping up saying, I'm him, come back, I've returned. And that has not ceased from the day of Jesus till now. There's always somebody jumping up. There was a guy in New York some years ago. Everybody thought he was the Messiah, and I can't remember his name. Obviously he wasn't, because the world's pretty screwed up right now. But there's always somebody saying this. There was a fellow that was a contemporary of Jesus. His name was, I knew I was going to have trouble with his name, Apollonius of Tyana. Look him up in Wikipedia. There's a pretty good article. Apollonius of Tyana. He was a Greek philosopher, but he was also a miracle worker. He roamed the land. He even went over to the Far East. They know, or are pretty sure, that he traveled clear into India in his day. He lived a pretty long life, but he was basically a Greek philosopher. Many thought a competitor of Jesus. And it was even said of some of the followers of him that Jesus was the fraud. Jesus was the inferior one, which is pretty interesting. But there was an example of where he raised, I think it was a young bride had died, and he went over to where she was on the pyre and raised her from the dead, and worked all kinds of miracles. He was, they say he was telepathic, and he was an actual historical figure. So look him up, because he's an interesting character that we don't know. I never had heard of before a couple of years ago. But there were all these teachers that were jumping up saying, I'm it. And people, they were looking for a following. And we, again, see that today too. But that's a very important thing when we talk about the second coming. The whole thing started as if it were an immediate thing that was coming. And today, because it has not happened, it's been reinterpreted. But that's what we always do. See, that's why the second coming in the first place, it's a reinterpretation of the first coming. The first coming was not supposed to involve a second coming, if that makes sense. Like the Christ was supposed to show up and do his thing, when he shows up. So he shows up according to the perception of the believers, and he doesn't do his thing. So how do we explain that? Well, he's coming back, and he'll do his thing then. And he's coming back any day. That's why Luke was pretty big on get rid of all your possessions. He was the first. The early Christian church was the first communistic society. It's where everybody puts their stuff in a single pile, and you have no ownership of anything. And the reason for that, the thinking is, he's coming any day. So let's not get too tangled up in our material problems here. The best way to do that is just give them all to us, and we'll take care of the rest. And you can not get too materially disoriented and carried away by all this earthly stuff. Luke is really big on that. Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke says, blessed are the poor. And so we try to reconcile that. I think Luke meant blessed are the poor. You're blessed if you're not attached, because he's coming and you'll be ready. But Matthew was writing to the Jews. They didn't think of it as a blessing to be poor. Blessing to be poor in spirit is to be humble, open to inspiration, open to new ideas, completely different idea. So these different writers had different interpretations, different ideas of what should occur. So anyway, the early church thought it was living in the last hour, just any moment. And John the Baptist is another example. He's not of this mindset necessarily. He's of a different mindset. It's like repent or you're going to hell. Basically, it was a very crass presentation, but it was the same idea. Repent now because the end is near, kind of thing. It's the guy walking with a billboard down the streets of New York. The end is near, kind of thing. So the defining principle, you can take the Easter resurrection story however you want. I believe that people experience Jesus to this day. I truly believe they do. If you get into the near-death research, Jesus plays a fairly prominent role. The researchers think that it is culturally based, because if they're dealing with Chinese near-death experiences, the Chinese have a whole different mindset. Usually, instead of a being of light or a Jesus that appears to them, it's usually a guy at a desk that's keeping records. And they encounter this fellow, and he looks up, he's busy, doesn't want to be bothered, but he looks up and sees that someone's standing there saying, "What are you doing here? It's not your time." And they send him back. But it's a whole different thing. So they think a lot of that is culturally based, but Jesus plays a pretty prominent role. And just the idea of seeing people when they pass, having experience with people who have gone on, it's a very common occurrence. I had a friend, a couple, husband and wife, that lost a 16-year-old boy to cancer. And the father was just devastated. They both were devastated, but the father he was a new car salesman in Kansas City, and where we lived at the time. And he was like a top salesman prior to this. His son dies, and he went to pot. He just went down the hill. But one night he went to sleep, and he had a dream. And his son showed up. His son appeared to him in that dream. And he was totally convinced that it was him. He had no doubt in his mind, and that he was okay. And from that moment on, he got back up. And he started living his life again and getting back in the saddle. I think these are real experiences. I think to me, it's not a question of, do people appear? Did Jesus appear to his followers? I think so. Why didn't he appear in the flesh to the doubters? If I were really wanting to cause some problems with the people that did it to me, I would have appeared to Pilate. Said, you really messed up here. You didn't get me like you thought you did. Show somebody that is a doubter. But I don't think from that point of view we want to hurt other people. We want to prove them wrong or anything. You let them believe like they believe. It's okay. But I don't doubt that people saw Jesus, that they had this experience, because it happens today. We hear stories all the time of things that are happening. You can try to, rationalize it. And is it a trick of the mind? Is it hallucination? Is it whatever? But they change people. People are changed as the result of this. This man that lost his son woke up, came back to life, came back to his old self. His son was okay. He knew that. That was an experience. So you don't have something like that with just a regular dream. I've dreamed of my father many times. And it was like, it's always been very personable. When he appears to me, it's usually very interesting situations. And it may be him. I don't know. It is not a life-changing experience for me. It may be just a dream. But I like to think it was him. It's been quite a while since I've had any of those, but I had a whole series of them just not that long ago. But I don't doubt the power of that. I don't doubt the reality of that. Do you think you die when you leave your body? I don't think I do. I don't think I'm going to. I don't think you do either. So why would we not, in some cases, be able to experience people that have come back? Myrtle Fillmore used this whole thing of Jesus to get her healing. She would sit with an empty chair next to her and read the scriptures and imagine Jesus was sitting there explaining the scriptures. And that was a very powerful thing for her. And okay, it was imagination. I wouldn't consider that like a sighting or anything like that. I don't think she did. But she was intuitively open to him being there teaching her. And she had a total recovery. There's something to be said for that. Her life was changed. So I don't doubt any of these things, but to the extent that where he appears and says, put your hand in my wound and all of this stuff, I think that's probably an embellishment from the writer. Doesn't matter to me if that happened. It doesn't change one thing in my thinking. If I found out Jesus didn't even exist, nothing would change for me. My faith would still be the same. My understanding would be the same. It doesn't matter. But if you need that kind of thing, then you've got it. It's there. And it's very well elaborated in the four Gospels. That's one thing about some Unity people, some ministers they try to look beyond the literal and into the metaphysical only, as if that's what the writer had in mind. It's not. What the writer had in mind is what he wrote. The metaphysical stuff probably comes from the teachings of Jesus himself, from the sayings attributed to him, not necessarily from the writer. I have great suspicions about whether or not these writers understood what Jesus was talking about. His disciples didn't understand him. And he chastised them on several occasions. You guys have been with me all this time and you still don't get it? He's talking from an inner level. They were listening from an external level. You're the Messiah. You're supposed to be knocking these Romans off. That's Jesus was surrounded by zealots, people that carried the swords under the knives and swords under their garments, because they were ready for an uprising any minute. Just give us the word, Messiah, and we'll go after him. And he lived with those people. They were part of his culture, his following. So I'm sure he understood where they were coming from. He grew up with that whole culture. So he would have known that. But he didn't denounce them necessarily. Nor did he prove to them that he was, or try to prove that he was the fulfillment of their expectation. That's what one scholar says. When you're reading the scriptures, beware that you find the Jesus you're looking for. In other words, we're laying down a template of preconception when we look. But let's not take away what the writers were actually doing. They are promoting, they're evangelists. They're promoting the teachings of the early church, the developing teachings of the early church, not necessarily the teachings of Jesus. And that is a huge distinction. So it's just something to keep in mind. And I mean, that's what the series is about, is to recognize the difference. But don't throw away the literal interpretation. Understand what the early church was trying to make of Jesus, because it's very helpful. Then you can decide from this line, this verse, that verse, is this Jesus speaking or is it the writer? If it's promoting the teachings of the early church, you can be pretty sure it's the writer. If it's saying that nobody understands or has a hard time understanding, like my sheep hear my voice, I completely understand that as one who is talking about ideas that can only be understood intuitively, not from the head. But the sheep and the shepherd, all that stuff has become a great image in traditional Christianity is Jesus is the shepherd and we're all the sheep following. But if shepherds would bring their flocks together at a watering hole and mix them up, which would happen, each shepherd could call his own sheep and those sheep would come out. That makes perfect sense. Your dog will do that. It's like they hear your voice. And what he's saying is, if you're tuned into the level from which I'm speaking, you'll get what I'm saying. You have the ears to hear and you have the eyes to see. If you don't, it's going to be gibberish. That's why he condemns so often the learned, the people that had the education, scribes and the Pharisees, because they had head knowledge. Their intuitive side was not open. And actually the intuitive side, the Jesus people, were a threat to that whole thing. So the defining principle through this whole Easter thing is Jesus illustrated in the saying I used last week about the seed falling into the ground and dying. And then once it dies, it comes up and bears more fruit. That's the principle of life that we're talking about here. Easter illustrates the defining principle in Christianity. Life, not death, is the truth behind all appearances to the contrary. But does death play a part of it? Do we have to die to the old before we can move on to the new? It's like our friend that lost his son. He was experiencing the idea of death, but he himself had to die to the belief that he had lost his son, to the belief that his son was dead. He had to die to that. And that's why this probably had to occur to him in a dream. Just like Joseph. Joseph sees his wife that he's never been with is pregnant, and he's got a problem with that. So he has to go to sleep and have a dream. He has to have an intuitive experience that this is really okay. Just open yourself to this deeper level. And Joseph was okay after that. He had an experience that changed the way he thought. But this death is part of the whole thing, but it's like a process, part of the process. Something limited has to die so the greater can come forward. That's the whole message. And that's what we're seeing, all around us right now. We invoke the resurrection principle in our current affairs by dying to or letting go of the old and affirming the new. If you're in a situation now where something has died, and that can be a person, it can be a situation, it can be a lifestyle, it can be anything that you are struggling with, any condition in life. You're looking at that and you're saying, oh, I wish that hadn't happened. You're still alive to that thing. And the principle is learn to let go, learn to die to that. Like the seed that falls into the ground goes through this whole dark process, or process in the dark, it dies. But that's not a bad thing. We have this problem in our life. We go alone into our closet, into some room where we're not to be disturbed. As Jesus said, we shut the door to the world. And we pray to the Father who's in secret. That's a way of saying, die to that level of experience you're having. Don't let this thing trigger that negative, say, I'm done with this. I'm not going to keep going through this. And what happens is a new life begins to surge, a new inspiration begins to rise in you. You start seeing things from a different perspective. It's like the man that woke up from his dream and his son was alive in his mind and he got his life back. He started living again. Open your mind to God's resurrecting life right where you are so that every point of your experience may expand and flourish. I will say this is not easy to do, only because we're in such a habit of looking at appearances and judging by appearances and saying, look how bad that is. How could I possibly feel good about it? We're very trained to do that, and that's understandable. We may not even say anything. Yesterday the irrigation system, which I call the irritation system, was flooding again. My first reaction, I wish something would die around here. I get so tired of this thing. So I did. I just sat down and, let it go. And Audrey called. She was over here and talked to the ditch runner and all this stuff. He turned the water down, so he was up too high apparently and choking us all off. But even small things like that, they can ruin your day. But the Easter principle, the resurrection principle, applies. You take that thing and you stop reacting to it. You let it go until you start having to do a new experience. You find your center of power. I thought about that when Diane shows up a little bit late this morning. She couldn't get out of her garage. Somebody had to roll the stone away. Her door wouldn't open. So she had to mess with that for a while to get out. But we have those kinds of things, and they're stress-inducing. So we die to those, and there's 100 a day can happen. Okay, I've got a denial and 2 affirmations here. I'd like you to join me in, or 3 affirmations about the resurrecting prayer principle. Let me say each line first, and then I'll invite you to join me in speaking it out loud. I now release all appearances of failure. Think of something that's going on right now that you're struggling with. Apply this. Make this work in your life. I now release all appearances of failure. Together? I now release all appearances of failure. The resurrecting power of God is at work in me and in all that concerns me. Together? The resurrecting power of God is at work in me and all that concerns me. In joy and in peace, I rise to new heights in understanding and experience. Together? In joy and in peace, I rise to new heights in understanding and experience. Together. Thank you, God. Okay, so when you say thank you, God, you should be at a place where you're okay. It's okay. I'm good. I've found my center of power. That's why we thank God. Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you've received it. When you receive something, don't you say thank you? That's the whole thing, the whole idea. So it is another way to say it. All right? Appreciate you all coming out, and hope this is a great Easter for you, that you resurrect and do all the things that whatever you're dealing with.
You've been watching a talk presented at the Unity Church of Grand Junction by Reverend Doug Wator. We would like to thank everyone who joined us here today in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado, as well as those of you who are joining us online. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. Also, please feel free to share this video with anyone you think might be interested or benefit from this message. If this video brought value to your life, please consider making a donation by clicking the link below to our PayPal donation account. Thanks again so much for watching.